All right, we continue on with airports, and like we said before, the airports you'll see in the civilian world have the circles around them and whatnot. If there is an X through the airport, that means it's closed. And also, if you have a seaplane bases will be noticed, and an important one too that's probably overlooked are heliports. So that has the big H in the middle there. And speaking of airports, it's important to note that they're not all created equal. It's easy to look at them on the chart and see these symbols and go, well, an airport's an airport. And I ran into this, for instance, when doing a flight here recently and called up the FAA's Before You Fly app, which is something we'll talk about a little later, but it basically just puts any airports around you in kind of no-fly zone circles, which there is a way to fly. However, I thought, well, it doesn't really tell the complete story as far as the type of airport it is. So, for instance, you have airports that are huge, like these Charlotte Douglas International Airport is just a big airport. They have a north-south runway. So, in this case, we add 10, and this is 18 right. So, say for instance, this is north, basically straight up. So offset just a hair. And when you're landing, your direction is 180, so you have that 180 degree compass heading there right in front of you, and that's kind of how that works. The R is the right runway, so if you sort of well, let's go from here. This is 36, so 360 is 0 or north. You have the left runway, you have a center runway, and a right runway. That's pretty crazy stuff. Atlanta Hartsville's even worse, or I'd say worse, but they've got a lot of different runways, and it's could be kind of interesting here. Charlotte's has a crossing kind of runway as well, and it's 7,502 feet by 150 feet wide. That's runway 5 and runway 23, so it's a northeast southwest runway. This is 05 runway, or 050 on your heading, and this is 230. If you're pointed this way, you're pointed 230 degrees, pretty close to southwest or even west to 270. All right, so the point is here you have very gargantuan airports like this Class B airport, and they're not all created equal, because you might have another airport, for instance, that's a medium-sized airport that serve light commercial, corporate aircraft, companies that own corporate airplanes, and recreational type flying. They may or may not have an air traffic control tower. Johnston County Airport is a satellite airport, or known as the satellite airport to the Raleigh-Durham International Airport. I guess I'm favoring my North Carolina airports when I have this discussion, but they're pretty cool. And incidentally, Johnston County is very supportive of drone activity as well. You just have to contact them and tell them what you're up to and notify them and work it out, which is really nice to see that manned and unmanned can coexist. Can't say that for all the airports, but in this case, they work really well, and they have a lot of diverse operations. So they've done some drone stuff on the airport, as well as corporate and charters to people who build their own airplanes and bring them out. Some light sport aircraft, which are kind of in between a regular recreation airplane and an ultralight as far as weight wise, and probably even some ultralights at some point, but it's probably sort of periodic. And with that comes the challenges of making sure everybody is safe and you don't have any issues there. Depending on what kind of traffic, the amount of traffic, they may they may have a air traffic control tower, but it's kind of a smaller type one. This is if it did have a control tower, it would become a Class D airspace. So remember, those dashed blue lines around the airport is designated as Class D airspace. This one has G and E above it, as far as being non-towered. Like we said before, they used to call them uncontrolled, but that didn't sound too good. So they're non-towered airports in this case. Uh, and then last but not least, though, you can have just small locally owned airports, such as this grass strip, grass airfield. It's located in Thomasville, North Carolina, which has got its name from the old Thomasville Furniture Company back in the day. And privately owned grass strip landing field can be privately owned, but the owner can be open to the public using it. So it's privately owned, public use type field. The owner can elect to, let his or list his airfield as private, which means it's privately owned and private use. But it's also listed on the chart, though. They keep it on the chart because it can be used for emergency situations or by permission. And really, that's usually motivated by insurance for the most part. Or you might just have somebody that has an airfield and, hey, this is my own and I don't have anybody here but myself, my aircraft. Or, it might be a small operation, but typically it's predicated on insurance and that sort of thing. So this one would be a Class G with some E above that, and very good for use. All you have to do is just drop them a line if you're within 5 miles of the airport, and say, hey, you mind if I fly here? They might be a little harder to get up with. So, for instance, this airport is publicly owned, and it's public use as well, and there'll be somebody there pretty much all the time. With these particular airports, it's a little harder to track down who's who. There is an airport guide that is published, that the state publishes for the different types of airports, and has contact numbers. I recommend using airnav.com, and you go to airnav.com, you can put in the state, for instance, and then down at the bottom of the page there'll be a thing for private airports, and it'll have the phone numbers and whatnot. You might have a hard time with some folks or getting back to you if you leave a message. And if you fly in a certain area, a lot of times maybe you can come up with some sort of notification via email or otherwise that you could sort of file away, just to show that you did the due diligence there. All right. This also goes the same for heliports, and all heliports are not created equal. On that flight I was telling you about that I made a while back, 3 airports, a regional airport that was kind of the size of Johnston County came up, a heliport that was associated with a hospital was one, and then a small grass strip was also in the area, but they all look like these concentric circles and a big massive airspace. You would think you were at some Chicago area, but that's not necessarily the case, and it really depends. So, for instance, in our area, we have the UNC hospital in Chapel Hill, and they're extremely active. They're a major hospital hub, and they have one of these rooftop landing type helipads. And I've spent a little bit of time there at this hospital, and boy, you really notice when the helicopters come in, and you can hear them. It's pretty interesting to see how many operations they have. However, you might have another hospital, like in the flight I took, it's in a more rural area, and the hospital just happens to have a landing pad there for their helicopters, in the off chance they get somebody that needs to be transported to the closest hospital. A lot of times, typically, they'll get rerouted to a major hospital because of the serious nature of those type of flights. And I say that to say this is you still need to get permission to have that mechanism, but not all heliports are created equal. You might have a very slow hospital that it's sort of a accessory type service that they offer, or a major intricate part of their operation, like UNC, for instance. how and also there's folks notice the like these houses here and whatnot. There might be just a privately owned helipad. An individual owner might own this particular helipad that, and they own a helicopter, or just like the grass fields might have just a select amount of folks. The message here is, not all airports are created equal. They all have a different capacity. And this is a good segue into special use airspace, which is our next section. So we're leaving airports behind, but talk about special use airspace. You can see on the chart these different types of airspace. You have prohibited, restricted, or warning areas, and you'll see the blue hatch lines. You may see an alert area with the magenta hatch lines here, which is indicative of a lot of training areas, and then military operations areas, or MOAs, is another type. So we'll break these down a little bit for you. All right, so prohibited areas are just like they say, prohibited. This was the area around Crawford, Texas, which I believe George Bush, former president. This was the one around his ranch there, as I recall. And of course, there's a lot in Washington D.C. area as well. Camp David has a big prohibited area around that. And as you might imagine, these are, as the name says, prohibited. Can't fly there. So manned aircraft cannot fly there. Unmanned aircraft can't fly there for all intents and purposes. There may be some offhanded chance. I know occasionally somebody will pop up, I got permission to fly in the prohibited airspace. And a lot of times it's just, they knew somebody, or they're able to contact who controls the area and get special permission, but that's sort of an extreme case. In general terms, 90% of the time, or 99% of the time, it is prohibited, which means it's just a no-fly zone whatsoever. Now you can see restricted airspace here, and notice each restricted airspace has a number associated with it, R4401, A and B, Alpha and Bravo. So there's probably, it looks like, 2 sections to this airspace, which I don't see it within here. But if you notice, there is magenta hatch lines here outside. Now, restricted means that it's a step down from prohibited. So prohibited is a no-fly zone. Restricted means that there are a lot of restrictions. Does it mean you can't fly here? Not necessarily. And you can look down on the chart itself at the perimeter of a physical chart, or in the notes section of an electronic chart, and find out more information on a restricted area. Figure out who the controlling agency is. Who controls that? I would say it was probably the haggler here that controls that, and they'll give you contact info who you can reach. More times than not, you might even see an altitude that starts. Typically, it might not start at the surface, and you're good to fly in that particular area. The other thing is if they're not using the airspace, I know in our state here, North Carolina again, they use the folks down east with the Marine Corps. They say, well, when we are not using the airspace, which is a good chunk of it, that we'll turn it back over for civilian use, and they do that through special permission there. All right, and here's this specific military operations area that we kind of saw in that last graphic, and you can see the magenta hatch lines here. Typically, this is just military, restricted, and military operations area, typically both training type areas. The restricted might have a little more advanced. It might have some controlled firing demonstrations and that sort of thing. Can you fly in MOAs? Yes, you can fly in MOAs. They're either designated as hot or cold, and that's the terminology they use. To either hot means they're being active, like think about a hot gun, it's ready for the range, or it's cold and it's not being utilized. And when it's cold, you can use these areas with no problem. When it's hot, would not recommend doing that. By law, it's sort of an area where you could fly through there. I do recall on a specific flight mission I was on, it was a hot area, and we were not this particular MOA, but I was on a manned flight. We were kind of cutting the corner of one, and it was hot. Didn't think it would be an issue, but looked off the wingtip and saw these A-10s that were in a formation, and they were kind of pointing at us and then turning off. And I was like, oh, this must mean they're doing a lock-on practice. Not a very good feeling. And on a serious note, you probably wouldn't want to fly in areas that are hot. That was just probably a mistake on our part of trying to cut this corner a little too sharp in the area that we were in. You'll also notice blue hatch lines that are warning areas, and these are off the coast. And you're supposed to stay away from these areas because they could have a lot of uncontrolled firing, dog fights, and that sort of thing. Once you get outside of just a few miles off the coast, it's really no man's land to a certain extent. There's no controls. It's pretty wide open, and therefore I would be very hesitant in flying in this area. Surely you wouldn't want to take down an aircraft that's practicing maneuvers when it ingests a drone in its jet engine, and that could feasibly happen. I'm not saying don't do it at all. I've seen some pretty cool drone shots, taking pictures of boats and what have you. Just so you're smart about it is really the main point. One kind of sidebar here. Notice these little hatched areas here, and these are national wildlife areas and are typically no fly zones for drones and manned aircraft pilots up to a certain altitude. So usually there's a crossing altitude, and you're just trying to protect the experience of the wildlife and the folks visiting the park as well. And you can see also more MOAs right in this area here. If you pay attention, you can see a lot of these gray lines, and those are military routes. So just like manned aircraft have what they call Victor airways, which are highways in the sky, well, military aircraft do as well, and they practice cross-country type flying, and they'll either do it at very low levels or a little bit higher levels, and one could impact operations of a drone operation if you're not careful, because they practice that low level flying for a reason. It's a tactical exercise, and you can see these are military training routes, MTRs, and they're shown in gray here. There's VR routes and IR routes. So IR routes are instrument routes, which means, just like with manned aircraft, that there's somebody looking inside of the cockpit flying specifically by instruments there to fly the aircraft, which means their time outside looking around is very limited. And then you have VR routes, which are visual routes, and that means they're flying along visually, as you might imagine there. And if the number is 4 numbers, like this is 3 numbers, but if it's 4 numbers, that means the route is 1,500 feet and below. And so the memory aid is if it's 4 numbers, it's 1,500 feet below. If it's 3 or less numbers, that means it's 1,500 feet or above. And that's above ground level. And you can see some of the altitudes covered here with these special military activity routes. More familiar with IR and VR routes, really. I see very few of these on the aeronautical chart. So the message, though, is if it's a 4 number, be very aware that it could cause a conflict as far as, mid-air collisions and what have you. All right. As we pointed out, here's your military training route right here. So this looks like it's 3 numbers, which means it's 1,500 feet and above. So you should be okay if you're flying commercial drones at 400 feet and below. Some of the ones that you don't hear a lot of information about are, miscellaneous kind of jump areas. You got parachute jump areas. and that could be an issue there as far as that goes. Might be able to get some cool drone shots with parachute jumping. However, tempting that is, that could be a very dangerous activity. In the best situation, would have to be a very well coordinated effort. It's nothing you just do kind of on the fly, so to speak. Even if it is well coordinated, that would be a tough situation to work out. Take a lot of coordination experience and what have you, for obvious reasons. There's glider operations areas as well. You can see the big G there in the glider looking shape. Ultralight activity, you can see hang gliders, and then here we go. We got unmanned aircraft activity, so that's pretty cool. We have designated a couple of spots in the state I live as UAS kind of demo areas, and have special provisions for that. And they're I don't think they're shown on the chart just yet, but I wouldn't be surprised that would happen in the future. As we talked about in that other chart, there's these kind of dotted line surrounded areas which are wildlife areas, and you have to be really careful because it's typically not permitted to fly in these areas. You say flight operations below 1,000 feet over the designated areas within the. This is just an example. The Gulf it violates the regulations there. Looks like NOAA has a dog in the fight, as they say, when it comes to that. Typically, not a good flight area. We have run into that with the Wright Brothers Park. Folks wanted to fly drones, and most of the federal parks have said no to drone flying. They feel like it's a hazard and ruins the experience for folks, which is kind of ironic being the first flight area. But having said that, I understand it in a way. However, there is somebody was want to take a picture of the monument and that sort of thing, and I think if I were doing that, if you had a strong enough zoom, you could just be right outside of that area and get some good shots as well. Not that this is permission to do that. You'd have to take a closer look at the chart, make sure you weren't in the bigger park area and that sort of thing. But there are some options out there. There are special flight rules areas, and like the Grand Canyon is one of those areas. You might have some up in DC area as well. And they've had so many issues with folks flying manned aircraft that it has become a problem, which it is a park, so drone flying, as I recall when I was out there, is not permissible. I did take a picture of a no drone zone sign there, sadly. But there are special flight rules areas because they've had some mid-air collisions and that sort of thing that's created some problems. Now, there are temporary flight restriction areas that are listed, and most of them are not listed on a chart per se. They might have some information related to, if you notice, P40, so that's the prohibited area and restricted area, and it says expanded by temporary flight restrictions. So it's kind of a tack on to what's on the chart. Typically, TFRs, temporary flight restrictions, are national security, so like a wildfire situation, a natural disaster. When the president moves, that you'll see that a TFR actually moves with him or her, and it's kind of interesting during the election time as it kind of came down to the wire and we figured out who all was running. They afford a lot of these extra protections to the major contenders in the race. And you have this problem, they go on a bus tour, well, this bubble follows them around, and that makes it very tough for pilots to make sure they're not violating those TFR areas. Again, like the prohibited areas, I'm sure you'll get the offhanded person will say, yeah, but I contacted the person, the controlling agency, or the person responsible for the TFR and got permission. That's probably just a very couple percent of the time you could get permission, or if you're associated with maybe like a news organization that has a rapport with the folks in the area, or some disaster relief type. But for the average person that has a drone business, it's very unlikely. But where do you get temporary flight restriction information? The one I like better, and we'll expand on this a little bit later on, but the when you get your weather briefing, you go to FAA.gov. It'll be shown on the weather briefing, 1-800-WXBrief.com, or giving them a call, and they could tell you. However, I'm sort of a visual learner. I don't know if many of you are, but to me, it's a lot easier just looking at a graphic map. So if you go on FAA.gov, you can actually look up graphic TFRs, and it will show them on a map, and then you could click on them and get more information about that specific TFR. So that's kind of nice when you can do that, and then even utilize the flight service number and whatnot. There's a thing called an air defense identification zone, and these are different borders and whatnot. DC does have an ADIS. Usually you sort of associate this with those kind of coastal areas where, once you get outside of the U.S., the contiguous U.S., you kind of go into this ADIS area, which is like a no man's land of sorts, and you have to be really careful flying in those particular areas. But Washington, D.C., since 9/11, has kind of adopted some of the same things. And like we talked about before, if there's kind of an MO to your flying and you're just starting out, I would stay well away from the DC area, unless you're really well schooled. Manned aircraft pilots have to take a test to be able to fly in the area and all that. So it's just a lot more complexity than you probably want to start out with for these areas. All right, then you have flight restricted zones, and these are against national security, so there's a lot of different flavors to these. Now, just kind of getting back to airspace, this is more related to the Class B, C, and D airports. I would probably attach this to those, but the reason I didn't is there's just so few of them. We happen to have one in Wilmington, North Carolina. It's called a TRSA, TRSA, Terminal Radar Service Area, and it's associated with the Wilmington Airport. You can see the Wilmington Airport, and it goes out like 30 miles here, which is huge. You can see that. It looks very intimidating. It's as big as a Class B, right? You go, oh, this must be big time. However, it's really a throwback to the previous airspace classification system before they adapted the alphabet soup airspace designations, or the ICAO standard. And they were like, what do we do with these TRSAs? And they just kind of left them in as a throwback to the old system. But you can see this goes from surface to 6,000 feet within this particular inner circle area. As you can see, it does have that blue hatch line, which means there's a Class D airspace right over it, but then it goes out here. And they say that the service there, or your approvals to get in and out, is what they call voluntary. Of course, when you come in too close, you have to contact control tower. For the unmanned folks, you have to get permission from the tower to operate within. I think my main point here is just don't let this swath of airspace scare you off, because it can be a lot easier to navigate than it appears on a chart. Probably won't run into that in a lot of areas of the country there. All right, and then we'll talk about the compass rose and some isogonic lines of variation, and that sort of thing coming up next. So stay tuned.